Good evening, gentlemen and three ladies. It's a conference to do with finance, and I thought the ladies spent all the money. For those of you who recognize me from television, my name is Chetan Sharma. For those of you who don't, that's all right, you haven't missed much. You all carrying cell phones? Could you please switch it off? Okay, is everybody comfortable? Could I request you to stand up, please? Could you just swap chairs with the person beside you? Okay, you can sit down. I'm sorry about that. Thank you for that. The idea was to get you out of your comfort zone. Because if you want to change, the first thing you've got to do is come out of your comfort zone. And today, change is going to be a very essential part of what we're going to talk about. Because the only thing that's constant is change. The choice is yours. Either you be the change or you make the change. But the fact is that you have to change. Because if you don't change, then you're going to be left with nothing but change in your pocket. So, it's time you change. Think of a four-letter word which is most prevalent around us. Think of a four-letter word which is most prevalent around us. The word begins with F. A four-letter word that begins with F. It's not what you think. That too. It's called food. Great. That's one. Any other? Fund. Any other word? It's extremely prevalent around us. Absolutely. The word I was looking for. Great. The word is fast. Anna Hazare goes on, given the state of corruption, this government wants to make a fast buck. The slowdown is happening, but it's happening fast. Take a look at our Olympic medallions, and you'll know that our athletes are not. Take a look at Generation Next, take a look at technology, and it's breaking all the hard and fast rules. At a time in our economy when what's on a high is interest rate, inflation, deficit, and subsidies. And when it's on a low is confidence, credit, profit, and accountability. The fact still remains that investments are slow. Savings are low. Despite that, the consumer, he wants to spend. The bank, it wants to lend. But people are wary to invest, and the government is wary to divest. And in this whirlpool of finance, it's all governed at the epicenter by one word, and that's called, another four-letter word, and that's called risk. And today, a part of our study is going to be about risks and opportunities. In the scenario today, in the global world, what are the risks? And from there, what are the opportunities for India in the global scenario? How do we do that? I'm not an expert, so I'll borrow some experts. I'll introduce you to three wise men who I'll be talking to and who will tell you a little more about what the state of the country today is, the state of finance, the state of economy across the world, its impact on India, and more importantly, what can we expect going forward. It's a pleasure first to invite on stage Ashish Parthasarathy. If there's anybody who knows HDFC Bank and who treasures it, it's the treasurer. Ashish has spent 18 years with the bank, so if there's anybody who knows about HDFC Bank, it's Ashish. I'd like to call upon an old friend from the stock markets, Prashant Jain, Chief Investment Officer. And if anybody who knows how to pick stocks, it's Prashant. So you can talk to him offline as well as to the big stock picks. Prashant. Prashant has got this deadly combination, the dream combination of an IIT and IIM, and he's got a 20-year experience in the field. And finally, I have a very old friend who I admire a lot, not only because of what he says, also because of the way he says it. I've spent about 15 years in this industry and probably interviewed everybody from Warren Buffett to the man next door in finance. There's one person I've admired is Abik. Abik Barua, Chief Economist of HDFC Bank. Of course, Abik has done the honors with the Delhi School of Economics. He's had his education overseas in the States. He's spent time with CRISIL, ABN AMRO. He's, of course, been advising RBI as well. So here's the panel for today, and our topic really is going to be, what is the global scenario right now? How is it going to pan out for the future? And of course, what's India going to do with it? Let me start with you, Abik. I'll start it with the typical Sylvester Stallone question. When he goes into a mess, his question is very simple. How bad is it?
Look at all the concerns and anxieties building up around the macroeconomic situation. You tend to come away very depressed. But once you start talking to companies, talking to individuals at the micro level, I think there is still some hope, still some optimism in the air. So I would think that yes, from a macro perspective, things look rather alarming. But I certainly don't think we're on the verge of a collapse.
Ashish, do you think that the world called recession, double-dip recession, is there a possibility, or are we just being anxious?
I would say the possibility is very bleak. There is a recession in some parts of the world. Europe, all of us know, is under recession. But other economies are showing growth, anemic though, but lower growth. I don't think a double-dip recession is something which I can foresee in the near future.
Is it because we can't afford it?
No, it's just the way the economies are. I don't think it's a question of whether we can afford it or not. The economies, the way they are moving, the way though growth rates are falling in the faster growing economies like China and India, but there is positive growth. Global forecasts across, forecasters are for positive global growth. So I don't see.
Prashant, what's the stock market point of view? I mean, we have been defiant to some extent. There seems to be a lot of disbelief at some level and self-belief and a hope at the other level.
I think stock markets are very forward-looking all the time, and they tend to discount a lot of negatives today, and they don't wait for actually the numbers to come out. And what I have seen is that if you focus on the news flow, you are likely to time the markets wrong. And instead, if you just focus on the valuations over a 2, 3, 5-year period, there is a very good chance that you will get it right.
So in one way, are you saying that the worst is over? Because if we've discounted everything, we are also presuming that things can only get better from here.
See, the PE multiples are very close to the bottom end of the trading ranges if you look at the last 20 years. And even when September 01 took place, even when Lehman crisis took place, even when BJP lost the elections and left came to power, even at those times, the PEs did not go below 11, 12 times. And that is where the PEs are heading right now. But of course, the assumption is that things will not go from bad to worse. There is an expectation that even though it is belated, that government will take some actions which we urgently need. And if that is done, I think the economy will very quickly come back on the rails.
I think that's a very important point. There is this classic debate in all our minds, whether we're stock market investors or analyzers or, well, journalists as well, is that is the problem only within? We feel that we can just tweak things around within our system, and we can address the global challenges far better than anybody else.
As far as the analysis and the coverage in the local media is concerned, there is a little too much emphasis on the problems that are happening internally. And we obviously keep talking about what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the US, and now in China. But we are not, we don't analytically think through what the impact of all this is. So my contention is, yes, there are internal problems, but we also have to accept the fact that we are living in a very difficult global situation. And that, I'm sure, has an impact as well. So it's a combination of both an adverse external environment as well as the problems internally of which we are aware. I think we tend to sort of flog ourselves too much for some of our internal problems. I mean they are serious, but I think if you take the specific issue of the decline in growth from all the way from say 9% to now expected growth rates of 5 to 6%, the external environment does have a serious contribution to it, and that can't be denied.
Okay, let's talk about the external environment. Let's try and understand whether there are opportunities out there. Of course, starting with the West, particularly US and Europe. Ashish, what's your take? I mean, the situation right now, of course, there is a huge attempt of fiscal consolidation. US particularly, they've been trying. Euro, of course, has their own internal issues. It's more to do perhaps with politics than economics. There's always the contention that it is hazardous to think of having a monetary union before a political union. So in a scenario like that, what do you think is the way forward? What is going to happen in the US as well as Europe?
Global economies, especially the Western economies, have over the last decade or so or more, have grown on leverage. Basically, leverage has played a large role in the growth seen in the Western economies. The consumptions have grown, saving rates are low, borrowing, obviously the economy, the government, the people, and everything is highly leveraged. So there has to be a correction. That correction can't happen overnight. It'll take a long time. So what that means is the Western economies are set for a long period of low growth, and their trend growth, as today, everyone talks about US growing below trend, the trend could itself change. It may not be the trend which we had seen.
Are you saying it's going to continue to, let's say, plateau from here? Could there be the possibility for degrowth from here and then a vertical rise? What is it that your estimate says?
I would go by the growth being a plateau growth, a low rate of growth through quite a few years, and a number of years could be a decade or so. So it's not something which will correct in a short period of time.
This is for the US or Europe as well?
For the US.
For the US. And for Europe?
Europe has problems of its own. So
right.
They are trying to resolve those problems. Some steps are being taken. But if they can't do something, quickly about it, there's a possibility that it can, enter into a situation which will be kind of a disastrous situation. And if that happens, then the scenario could be different. But the base case would be, yes, they would try and muddle through. You would see periods of low or even negative growth for quite some time in Europe.
Prashant, now let me confront your optimism. I've got a point for that. Assuming what Ashish says is correct, right? Which is we're looking perhaps at a decade-long period of, gestation, or you could say a plateauing growth in the US at best. Europe, perhaps things are a little more confusing, and it could get worse from here. The sense of optimism, is it a little too much in the Indian markets, or do you think that we've discounted all that in the prices?
I don't think that the Indian economy depends too much on the Western world. I have a slightly different view on this. And if you see, there are two ways in which you are linked to the global economy. One is by way of trade, exports, and two is by way of capital flows. I think India is structurally poised to grow faster than China in the current decade if we get our act together. Our key problem has been fiscal deficit. If we fix that, I think we should be able to grow faster. And any economy in the world, if you look at the history of flow of capital, any economy that is sizable and is growing very fast, it tends to get a lot of capital flows. So India could actually become more attractive in this kind of an environment where growth is becoming very scarce. But for that, we need to get our act together. As far as exports are concerned, 80 to 90% of the growth of exports from India is coming out of our gaining market share. It is, the world economy has grown at 3-4% a year, but our exports last 20 years have grown in double digits in dollar terms. Exports have actually grown faster than the local economy. And that is because our share of global merchandise, global exports is minuscule. It used to be 0.6% 10 years back. Today it is 1.6%. China is 12 to 13%. I, for one, believe that what has happened in IT exports, what has happened in pharmaceuticals, where India is clearly the leader worldwide, I think not on that scale, but incrementally our competitiveness even on the manufacturing side is improving rapidly.
Sure, I agree, I buy your point. But having said that, just to turn the question, what you said on its head, our dependence on exports is not that high. So its impact in the overall GDP will be that much lower. That's point one. Secondly, when you mentioned about competitiveness, you're obviously talking about a labor arbitrage, right, between India and other countries as well as China. I agree that, of course, wages have increased in China, but so have they in India. And if you look at the labor situation, the advantage, the benefit of a China wage inflation has actually gone to countries in Eastern Europe, like Poland, like the Czech, like Philippines, like Indonesia, Sri Lanka, even countries in Africa. So perhaps to say that India is going to be a direct beneficiary of China is maybe a little too simplistic, would you say?
If you look at Indian currency has depreciated by 50% against the yuan. Now that's a very, very large move in last 5 years, and that enhances our competitiveness. I think competitiveness is not just about labor arbitrage, it needs a lot of other things. See, almost all the countries that you mentioned are very small. I mean, a lot of people would like to set up manufacturing facilities in Eastern Europe, but you don't have people to set up large manufacturing facilities there. Similarly is the case with Philippines or Indonesia. Africa, I don't know whether the infrastructure, the skill levels are there or not. And in any case, I mean, these countries may also grow. So I am not saying that they can't grow, but my point is very simple, that given the base infrastructure, the capability of companies that we have in India, the advantage of a very large domestic market, and I think our competitiveness is incrementally improving against China, and that is what should lead to growth. So I'm not saying others can't grow.
Right. I think the labor point is good. We'll extend that. Is there anybody out here from the HR sector, by the way? Any human resource manager? Sir, what is your point of view of the current wage inflation? Do you think that the wages are going to rise from here? Because that's an important point for us to understand our competitiveness. Please identify yourself.
My name is Srikanth. I'm human resource head for Hewlett Packard HP.
Great.
Yeah, again, there are 2 points I want to make here. I think I'm quoting directly from a McKinsey study, which has been published and pretty popularly bandied about in human resource circles, saying that our wage advantage, or the arbitrage, the labor arbitrage that we have, will last, according to McKinsey study, for about 25 years more. Factor in inflation too. That's one. And the general increases are much better regulated in India. The likes of NASSCOM, so like the CIA and so on, keep a pretty close view on the whole, particularly the big sectors, the IT and the manufacturing sectors. And if you really look at it, the last 3-4 years, we grew by 8 to 9%. Incrementally year on year, and as compared to China, which grew about 12 to 13%. And factor in the foreign exchange thing which Prashant talked about, we still have an advantage roughly about 20 more years if we get our act straight and get the regulations and control well. So I think we still have an advantage on that too.
He's actually giving me a nice next question. Because if it isn't labor, everything else is going to be with structural issues as well as policy decisions. So that's an impediment as well, Obi.
There are bigger issues here. We sort of almost mandatorily talked about the demographic dividend and of the de-aging population and how we have an advantage over China because of their one-child policy and so on. All this is fine. But the question is, have we done enough to ensure that this demographic transition which is taking place, where people are getting younger and we are...
No, but where's the employability?
Yeah. So that's really the issue that I'd like to focus on, and this is something that every employer has to grapple with. Is this sort of demographic change really sort of translating into an effective supply of employable labor? I don't think it is happening at an adequate pace. And I think there are some nuances that have sort of built up over the last couple of years. Earlier, it was essentially a white-collar problem, right? But, for the last 2 or 3 years, with things like the NREG coming in and so on, there seems to be, at least from some of the companies that I speak to, a serious shortage of blue-collar workers, unskilled construction workers as well. So I think the labor issue is far from resolved. And I think if you have to sustain growth and you have to sort of play on your labor advantage, there has to be a lot more.
Employability in terms of supply. Does anybody disagree with that? Yeah, okay.
Make a point here.
Yeah,
so
sure.
you're talking about the supply side of labor. Thanks to the average age being lower compared to China, the one-child policy, you covered that. The issue is it's a good problem to have. I would rather not be faced with a shortage situation of employable labor as compared to the problem which you made, that is killing them to the level that you want.
I think the critical word is employable, right? We are seeing younger and younger people, but would you necessarily prefix the word young with employable? And I have an issue with that, because I think there is a disconnect between the supply of employable labor and the supply of labor. And I think that's very critical in the way I think about things.
Anybody else would like to? Yeah, Shrikant, you want to follow up on that?
Fair enough. He's
So
talking about skilling the
employability
labor.
continues to be. Okay, now looking beyond labor, I mean, there are enough labor pains, is that how would you look at a situation wherein India has to get competitive vis-a-vis, well, the other areas, and of course including China, and I'd like you to focus on China, Ashish, when you say this, is that in terms of policy, what is it that's really needed? Let's take something that can tweak things around and exponentially give us what we want.
I think again, these things are reasonably well known in terms of if we need to be competitive, and we are getting more competitive because of the exchange rate, because of availability of labor. As Abhit mentioned, it's more, have we done enough? I think that's where the question is. We have the advantages. If we could do more on those, build on those advantages, I think we could see a brighter future. Obvious things are like infrastructure, availability of power, ease of doing business. And these are the issues which are actually, I would say, effectively increasing the cost or economic cost of manufacturing or any product in this country.
Okay, let's then talk about the mood, Prashant. I mean, these issues, of course, are known. We've got a healthy stock market thus far. We've had a fairly good performance, at least of late. Now, is there an inherent sense of belief that the government will, at some stage, bite the bullet? And politically speaking, there's nothing that suggests that.
I think there is certainly hope, and I think September should be a key month, because I think the key issue in India has been fiscal deficit, and there are two things to do out there. Both on the taxation front, you need to increase taxes, and you also need to curtail subsidies. And the biggest element there is diesel. So I think the next 1 month the answer should be very clear. Because if they don't do it in the next 4-6 weeks, then really it becomes increasingly difficult.
Right. Now, you brought out 2 points about the impact of the external situation. Of course, one was competitiveness in labor. The second was foreign flows coming in, because that's going to be a huge inflow and a huge contributor to growth. Obik, your take on that?
Well, the external environment seems still fairly murky, and with the kind of problems that we are having in the political domain, and which is sort of impinging on policy, I don't see how the flow of FDI is likely to pick up. FII inflows seem to be purely a function of risk appetite. So you can have episodes of risk on and then huge episodes of risk off. So I think things are very volatile at this stage. But it's true that we need a lot more sustained flow of foreign capital to power our growth, and especially so since our aggregate savings rate have come down a bit, and we need some compensation from the external side.
Right. So Ashish, if you would, let's talk about FDI, for instance, as a focus. What is it that you're most hopeful of? Which FDI do you think is very possible, or which is most relevant, most important to give us that initial push?
I won't put it on a specific sector or anything like that. You talk about FDI and retail and FDI and so many things. I think the basic thing is make it easier for people to invest and see returns. As long as all the other risks, I think the investor can take in terms of currency, in terms of demand, all those sorts of things. It's the question of making it easy for them to invest, set up whatever business they want to, and then they will take the risk. That's businessmen and companies are geared to take risks.
And Prashant, what is the stock market looking at? What is it really hopeful about in terms of foreign inflows?
It's extremely hard to forecast, but if you look at foreign inflows into the capital markets, they've been investing in India for now last 20 years, and in 18 out of 20 years we have got positive inflows. So I think India is a natural recipient of capital. I think there is a lot of capital in the world, and we need to get our act together because India is all set to emerge as one of the top 5, top 6 largest economies in the world in the next 5 to 7 years. And along with that, if you grow at significantly, good growth rates, then I think capital inflows should come. In fact, they could go up meaningfully more.
You know, there is an apprehension, and we discuss this very often offline in the journalistic circles and with the economists, and which says that a lot of the money that's coming into this country is round tripping and, well, hawala money. Does anybody believe that? Do you believe that a lot of the money that comes around is not actual money that's flowing in as a general risk investment, but it's just round tripping? Nobody believes that. Great. Okay. Now, if you move on from growth and the possibilities of growth, let's put a number, because, you know, journalists always have fancy. We want numbers to play around with. If you were to assess or give yourself a number at the end of this year, fiscal, what's the number you're looking at realistically for growth? Obi, your take.
Well, I would have a reasonably dismal forecast for this year, because agriculture is likely to play spoil sport. So we have a number anywhere between 5.5% to 6%. But I think the bigger issue is, and to use a phrase which has been sort of bandied around all over the place, is whether in terms of growth prospects we have moved to this new normal, and whether we sort of come off from sustainable growth rates of over 8.5% to levels closer to 7%, and that's what, you know, agencies like the RBI seem to suggest. If that were the case, and I partly believe that that would be the case for the next at least 3 to 4 years, then I think a lot of the calculations regarding, you know, earnings, cash flows, etc., will have to be revisited. And I would sort of go with a 5.5% to 6% growth number for this year, and perhaps 7 to 7.5-ish average number for the next 3 or 4 years.
Ashish, your take?
I think I agree with Abhik on the 5.5 growth number for this year. Going in future, I think unless we sort things out, even a 7.5 seems to be too optimistic. And I would rather be in the 6-ish kind of range from here and there, or 6-ish, if we can't sort out our issues. Because once, we've talked a lot about fiscal deficit, and there is reasonably empirical evidence, we've seen it in India. Anything, when the fiscal deficit has, expanded, to get it back to, to correct it, it takes at least 3 to 4 years. It doesn't correct in a hurry. And all those 3-4 years take away growth from the economy. They eat into growth. So I would be...
So what you're saying is we should not, realistically speaking, look beyond 6% over the next couple of years.
6 to 6.5, I would say
that
would be...
Prashant, I want your personal opinion as to what it is, and I also want what you think the stock market right now thinks, because you talk to people, investors, as well as colleagues.
I don't think I'll, I have much to add on this, because I am don't have such a deep understanding of economy as Abhik would have, so I would go with that number. As far as corporate profitability is concerned, I think it could do a little better, because interest rates are clearly at a peak, and the interest expense as part of operating margins are very high. And I think as companies deleverage, and there is evidence that companies are trying to deleverage, and as interest costs come down, I think the profit growth rates they may hold up reasonably well, because profit margins currently are at a cyclical low.
Okay, let's have a show of hands. Anybody has a different point of view about growth rate? Anybody who's more optimistic or a little more pessimistic? Okay, how many of you think that we are going to touch a 7% growth rate on an average for the next 4 years? Show of hands. Nobody? One person, okay, great. 1 out of, I guess, 100. Fine.
2 actually, there's another gentleman there.
Great. 2% of our populi, great. How many of you think it's going to be not more than 6%? Another 2. How many of you think it's going to be just 5%? Which means everybody else thinks it's going to be over 8%, right? All right, now everybody's talking. Okay, 6.5 to 7%, perhaps that's where we are. Now, even to achieve that growth is going to be a mammoth task. Let me assure you that, and I'm sure what everybody else has said. Achieving 6.5 to 7% is going to be a mammoth task. So to understand how that task is going to be addressed, let's look at the possible impediments. We're going to divide this discussion into three parts for the impediments. We're going to touch upon interest rate, inflation, classic debate, inflation versus growth, and its impact on interest rates. Your take?
Well, it's not that classic a debate, actually, because the problem is that even as growth rates come down, it doesn't seem to have much of an impact on inflation.
Yeah.
So there's a huge problem there on the supply side, which is actually busting this classical relationship between growth, inverse relationship between growth and inflation. And the big culprit there is food. So unless we do something radical about the food economy, you will have this sort of lingering inflationary pressures.
So that's a structural or a supply side issue by and large.
But unless you lick it, unless you manage to sort of do something about it, you're still going to be stuck in a range of 6 to 7% inflation. And the RBI is just going to keep saying that, well, we're not comfortable with it. We want 5% inflation when you just can't get there. And they're going to squeeze growth. So we are in a peculiar, I'm not criticizing the RBI. All I'm saying is that it's not a classic problem. It is, you have to think out of the box to get out of this one.
Don't criticize the RBI, advise the RBI, because you've done that. What do you think they should do? Do you agree with their point of view?
To an extent, I do, and unless there is an effort to sort out some of the supply issues, I don't think they can really move significantly on interest rates.
Well, which brings us to the other question. If the supply issue, Ashish, is the problem, then even lowering interest rates should not make a difference. What's the harm in doing it? If you realize that, if you recognize it's not a monetary issue, and there are enough people in the corporate world who feel that some kind of an interest rate released from here will propagate their growth, why not do it?
Well, supply, demand are two sides of the same coin. Means, prices depend on demand and supply, well known. If you reduce interest rates, what will it lead to is the question to answer. Will it lead to greater demand or will it lead to greater supply? We are assuming if you reduce rates, there will be more investments, you will need more supply, and supply will grow faster than demand growth. And that's why it will possibly increase growth and bring down inflation. What RBI is afraid of, there's so much other supply bottlenecks that if you reduce rates, it will have some impact on demand, but the supply will not be able to keep pace with that some impact of demand, and that's why you will see inflation rising further, and that's where RBI is coming from.
As a banker, what do you prefer? Is it impacted you, or because you're a beneficiary from one side and you have an impact on the liability side?
No, I think what I would see is we do not have scope to reduce interest rates by large amounts, but given the fact that growth has come down by such a large, from a 9% to around 5.5% now, and prospects are not looking good, you could see some reductions in rates or a period of moderate reduction, but not too large reductions.
What's your take, Prashant? I mean, at the end of it all, the stock markets, the reaction to interest rates is always very volatile. You see the day whenever we have a credit policy, the variance in the bank nifty and the bank stocks is immense, and it doesn't even settle after a few days. So there is a clear desire to cut interest rates come what may.
I think interest rates 1 year from today should be lower, and how fast they reduce and how much they reduce, I think will depend to a large extent on what the government does. Because as Ashish said, I mean, you don't want to increase demand, and therefore I think the day fiscal deficit is cut, the day you drop subsidies, the day you increase taxes, that will ensure that demand conditions don't become buoyant even if interest rates are dropped. So I think interest rates can fall faster, more meaningfully, only when government takes some concrete steps to tackle fiscal deficit. But nevertheless, I think some fall will happen even if government does not act.
If the government doesn't fall?
If the government does not act.
All right. Now, if you want a reduction in interest rates and in a phased manner, how phased would it be?
I mean, all I know is that 1 year from today, interest rate should be lower. If fiscal deficit is tackled, RBI, I think, will be keen to drop rates faster and more meaningfully. And if nothing is done on fiscal deficit, then rate reduction will be slower and moderate.
Okay, let me then take you on the point you brought about a short while back, saying that as far as you're concerned, interest rates have peaked. There's no way that it can go higher. Is that a fair assumption, Abik?
I would agree with Prashant that we should see some rate cuts down the year, but they're unlikely to be dramatic. So the question is, what is sort of the market really pricing in? Is it pricing in sharp reductions? Is it expecting too much? Because my sense is that any sort of significant reduction in the fiscal deficit will have to wait a while. I think we are in a politically too complex a situation for any decisions to be pushed through.
Okay, let's take a show of hands on interest rates. How many of you think that interest rates can be cut and cut severely from here? Not severely. How realistically, what do you think? How much can it be cut? And you'd be happy with that? You think that that's good enough? Anybody else? Anybody else who doesn't think that interest rates have peaked, they can go even higher from here? You think interest rates could you have the mic, please? Please share your point of view.
My name is Shekhar and I work with Toyota here. Basically, I don't think interest rates are going to get cut ever because it's linked to the fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit is not going to get cut because the Reserve Bank has told us often number of times that the government has to do its bit and then we will do our bit. I don't think the government is in a position to cut the fiscal deficit, and therefore I think there's not going to be any interest rate reduction. What could happen is some tinkering with certain sectors which they want to prop up, give some kind of interest subsidy, etc., to perk up a particular sector. But beyond that, I do think with inflation rearing its head, I think interest rates will only go up, not down. But how much it'll go up by, I don't know. I'm sorry to be a party pooper in that sense, but that's my point of view.
No, that's all. The party will happen after half an hour. We're fine right now. Anybody else who has that point of view? It's a very interesting point of view. I'm glad somebody's at least brought about another point of view. Any other point of view on interest rates as to whether they can plateau, they may even not rise from here, they're going to be consistent over a period of time? Anybody else has anything to add to that? All right. Now, one impact or one continuing impact, and the reason why even Shekhar brought that point was fiscal deficit. Let's come to that. And we'll talk about fiscal deficit, but first, I want a complete consensus on if we have a situation, this is hypothetical, Ashish, would you prefer the scenario what we've gauged of having a 6% growth and let's say a 7% inflation? Would you prefer that to a scenario, let's say, of 10% inflation and 8% growth?
I would prefer the first scenario because I think that's a lower inflation can only ensure sustainable growth. Otherwise, I will see, booms and busts if the inflation numbers are very high.
Right. What about you, Prashant?
No, I would agree with him entirely.
Right. Obik, you have to disagree.
No, I'm going to agree on this one because I think the combination of 8 and 10 is impossible to sustain, and there's a question of sustainability.
Okay, give me a better option. What do you think is a better option in this scenario?
I think as a combination of about say 6% inflation and about 6.5% to 7% growth is what they should be comfortable with.
Comfortable. All right. Fiscal deficit. A broad view about fiscal deficit in the current scenario. Is there realistically a way of it coming down in the near future? Of course, you spoke about the political issues, but there are also economic related matters.
Well, I think the word realistically is the key word here. But I mean, there are various ways of getting it down, but that involves certain difficult decisions, particularly on subsidies that need to be made. But one of the points that, perhaps Prashant would want to comment on this, that Prashant made before when we were chatting earlier, is that if one of the reasons why the deficit has gone up, is because of sharp fall in the tax GDP ratio, and that's going to get sort of exacerbated by the economic slowdown. So one possibility is to actually play around with tax rates, actually increase tax rates, use surcharges of some kind to push the tax take up and that might, help perhaps the
I
market.
think you'd be limiting yourself to corporate tax. You wouldn't be choosing non-populist measures. You limit yourself to corporate tax,
Corporate tax,
or
perhaps.
higher income tax levels to that effect, which
Right.
don't affect, politically speaking, the impact on the masses.
True. One has to be a little careful on that, especially if you're sort of going into an election year. But there are, it'll, as I said, it could make a difference at the margin. But, I mean, there are some taxes, surcharges that can be increased and justified.
Ashish, you've been a head of so many various factions. There always, as a head, you always have tough decisions, but there are always easier decisions you can take first. What are the possible easier decisions one can take, which are, let's say, apolitical, which can at least make a substantial impact because the government is in a state of confusion. There are a lot of extra factors and unnecessary factors which it's confronting right now, but there are easy basic decisions it can still take and perhaps get us somewhere.
I find it, difficult to think of any easy decision the government can take. But, I think this came from Prashant and you would, I think some amount of tax increases would, go towards reducing the deficit. See, we've embarked on a program of social security programs to, possibly distribute gains of growth to a largest section of population. If that's the case, then it's imperative that they raise revenues from somewhere to meet those expenditure needs. So one, of course, is this. And the second thing is, if you have budgeted things like divestment, you need to divest.
Yeah, I mean, that to my mind was the easier one, really.
Whatever the price, at the end of the day, if there's a company who needs to raise resources, irrespective of interest rates, they will raise resources at the prevailing rate. Similarly, the government, if it has decided to divest, they have to divest to it.
And there are enough avenues to divest anyway, even small stakes, and they can go to get home. Prashant, your take?
I mean, if you look at last 5 years, what has gone wrong is that they have cut taxes, and there was no need to cut taxes. There was no demand, there was no expectation either. And you have cut corporate taxes, you have cut direct taxes, you have cut excise duties. I think these need to be brought back to where they were 4 years back. And I don't think, in my personal opinion, there is not any, no politics involved in this. If you increase excise rates by 2%, increase tax rates by, let's say, for people earning more than 5 million rupees a year, or bring in corporate surcharge. There will be some adverse comments, but I don't think...
Do you really think, in terms of quantum, it's going to make substantial difference? Because
Huge.
The areas, corporate tax I can understand, but the high income tax levels in terms of, the multiplier effect may not be that high.
Yeah, broadly, if you look at the government's tax collections, 40% is corporate income tax. And if you bring in a surcharge, it can make a very big difference. Direct taxes are another 20% roughly. And I would presume, I don't have the numbers, that the rich people would be paying disproportionately large amount of taxes. If you bring in a higher rate there, it could make a difference. Excise duty going up by 2% makes a very big difference. It makes a difference of almost 15%, 12 becoming 14.
So, you're comfortable with salvaging another 2% of corporate profitability, which anyways has been falling. You're comfortable with that? Because it'll change your PE multiples on the stock markets at some level.
See, when corporate profits are growing at 15% a year, it is okay, you lose 1 month's growth. But I think what the economy will gain by way of lower interest rates and therefore faster growth next year will be more material than what you would give away.
Anything else? Anything on the cut side? We've talked about increasing. After all, there is something about reduction as well. Obik.
No, I think the big problem really is subsidies, and you need to sort of address it very comprehensively. And oil subsidies are one part of the problem. But I personally have a serious problem with these large-scale, social security programs like NREG, which might be followed by food security. I think we need to make them far more focused, perhaps concentrate on the most sort of deprived districts and operate them there. Be very careful about tacking on another program like food security. We just don't have the money to fund these things, and I seriously believe that we need to do a rethink on things like NREG.
What about subsidies in terms of fuel and fertilizer?
Well, we obviously need to, completely reprice the subsidized fuel portfolio, but that has become politically so contentious that one doesn't see a way around it.
Ashish, do you also believe that at least the subsidy on diesel definitely has to be removed?
I think so,
Or at least reduced?
Definitely, without doubt. But as you were asking what are the easy decisions to take. This is obviously not an easy one for the government to do. But somewhere they have to bite the bullet. I do not know when and which government will bite the bullet.
At some level, of course, at least on the diesel cars, if you're looking at a presumption that you tax the rich at some level, at least diesel cars. Do you drive a diesel car, by the way?
Yeah.
All right, so you won't agree with that. Anybody thinks that there is a possibility or a need or a desire to reduce fuel subsidy? Do you think it's possible? Do you think it's desirable? Is it acceptable? Everybody's happy with the current state of fuel, the pricing of fuel? All right, if you look at fuel, the way it's fueled up a lot of things, the analogy really being is if you actually increase fuel prices, reduce subsidies, you also, what you do in turn is you control, you become more intelligent and more productive about consumption. And that's an area where people tend to miss out and realize that you'll actually be even saving on fuel and be a little more, yeah, Abhi.
No, I think this entire sort of business of fuel conservation and energy efficiency is sort of dismissed as some kind of Western affectation here. But I think in the fast-growing economies like China and India, conservation is a very big issue, and conservation can be encouraged through proper pricing. And although there was absolute silence from the audience when that question was asked, I think it is a little unfair to be paying the kind of ridiculously low prices that we do pay for things like LPG. Not too many of us use kerosene, but certainly LPG or diesel for that matter. And I think the middle class, and particularly the upper middle class and the affluent classes, can certainly bear a much higher load of the subsidy adjustment than they would sort of want to sort of let on.
But as Ashish said, that is a tough call. Now, when you move on from, when you look at fiscal deficit, there are structural problems. You look at inflation, again, there are structural issues. Somewhere perhaps where there may not be structural issues, but we still expose ourselves to risk is currency. I want your view first upon on the global currency. What do you see the dollar from here? What do you see the euro? Do you see the euro existing? How do you see the euro behaving vis-a-vis the dollar? Ashish?
Yeah, at this point in time, our base case is that, euro will exist. Euro will exist in the shape it is today. Euro will, in the short time frames, it will move up and down with risk sentiment. Euro has always been a currency which most people expected it to depreciate. So the short positions, etc., have caused it to bounce back every time there is a relief of some sorts in the Euroland. But I think over a longish period of time, euro will be at lower levels from what we see it today, because the euro, as I had said before, the European economy growth rates will, the whole Euroline growth rate will be extremely low, maybe negative for some time, and other economies are going to grow faster, including the US, than the euro. So euro would come down from here. Obviously, it will depend on time frames, depending on when liquidity is injected in the Euroland, when it's injected in the US in terms of QE or whatever form. So rates will fluctuate, but euro, I think, is going to see lower levels from what it's today.
Abhi, what's your take on both the dollar as well as the euro?
No, I think the euro will survive. There might be, Greece might actually exit the union, but I think it'll be a managed exit, so everything won't sort of fall apart. Again, I sort of agree with Ashish that for a while the euro will be under pressure and perhaps lose against the dollar. But I think in the sort of kind of anxieties that have built up about Europe, we've completely sort of forgotten the fact that the US also has huge problems. And that has got sort of neglected completely. And at some point over the next year and a half, that will come back on the radar screen. I'm not too sure what kind of impact it will have on the exchange rate. You might just see a sudden rally in the euro when some of these US-related issues come back on the table.
So where does India figure? I mean, we're talking now about the relation of the Indian currency vis-a-vis the euro as well as the dollar. Of course, we've talked about current account deficit and how that impacts it. We've talked about FII flows, FDI question marks. FII flows may not continue. In a scenario like that, do you see a continuing depreciation in the rupee from here on? Ashish, first your take, then I'll go to Prashant.
Yeah, I think so. What we are looking at is a phase where the rupee is likely to depreciate because we have a current account deficit. Our inflation rates are much higher than most of the global economies, so rupee would tend to depreciate to the levels of inflation differentials. However, given our growth rates will be higher than most of the globe, the depreciation rate will be definitely lower than what the inflation differentials entail.
Right. What's your take, Prashant? And what are the stock markets at this point of time look at it? And tell me also about companies or about sectors, you may not want to talk about particular companies, who've really managed their forex counter well.
Forecasting stock market itself is difficult and I have failed at that. So forecasting currencies is even harder. But having said that, I think the key problem on the current account was the gold imports. Gold imports have gone up from under 0.5% of GDP 4 years back to 2.3% of GDP last year. It was not, the oil imports were not much of an issue. And fortunately in last 2 to 3 quarters, gold imports are down almost 40–50%. I think that the current account may just surprise us on the upside. I mean, it may turn out to be better than what many of us are expecting. And also, if oil prices don't go up, if they remain stable, oil is about 5 to 6% of GDP oil imports. If it remains flat, since volume growth of oil imports is much lower than GDP growth rates, I mean, that also, flat oil prices may lead to improving current account deficit. So I am slightly more optimistic on the rupee, but having said that, disclaimer is forecasting currencies I think is very challenging for me. As far as companies are concerned, I think companies that have not undertaken any mismatch between their revenue and the liabilities have done well. So companies which have, only those companies should take foreign currency borrowings which have earnings in foreign currencies. And if you do that, I think you are pretty safe. And companies which don't have dollar earnings and have taken foreign currency liabilities, they are the ones who are under pressure.
Any particular sector you'd like to point out to, which you think will continue doing well if, let's say, the rupee stabilizes out here or even continues to depreciate if it does?
I think in most sectors, Indian companies don't have global brands and Indian companies don't have any proprietary technology. So I think in most export sectors, we are price takers. I think to a large extent, to some extent, however, the IT service companies, the large IT service companies, they have at least stability in pricing and they don't shed those gains. So I think that is one sector which should benefit.
I'll digress from one question from currency because you touched upon commodities, which is itself a very important point of the commodity cycle. Have we peaked, for one, and its impact on global growth as well as inflation?
I think it's a sort of a plausible argument to claim that given the fact that global growth is likely to be tepid, the main growth drivers, US growth, China growth, is slowing down. India, is not big enough to compensate. We've perhaps seen the peak of the commodity super cycle that we saw in the past. And by commodities, I'm largely referring to industrial commodities, certainly not gold. Agricultural commodities have their own dynamics, and I think there is a very serious demand-supply issue there. But I would believe that commodity prices have sort of peaked out, and you might see some blips here and there. But I think that secular increase that we saw in the past has perhaps come to an end.
All right. Now, just a call on currency, Ashish. What kind of a range vis-a-vis the dollar would you be satisfied over the next 1 year of the rupee?
I think the broad range, and I'm giving it the broad range because that's what we have. I think we are likely to see over the 6 months a range of 53 to 58.
58, but a max of 58, you think?
I would say so.
Right. Your take on that, Prashant?
I would agree with him.
You'd agree. That's the same. Obiq.
No, I would, I mean, I would agree with this focus. The only thing that I would like to add to this is that there could be some appreciation towards the end of the year. And this pop in the rupee could come because, the European Central Bank or the Fed would pump in liquidity to the system. I think the difference between the way, at least I think about the currency today and how I thought about it, say, 5 years back, is that I would look for, going forward, a return to the kind of currency regime that we saw between 94 and 2003, which is average depreciation, not appreciation. The 2004-2007 appreciation
Was an aberration, you think?
well, not an aberration, but it was a phase, and it was a phase driven by excessive euphoria about certain economies. I think that phase is over.
So you're looking at a sustainable range of the early 50s, is that fair?
I'm saying 53 to 58 in the near term, and then
Was this pre-decided, by the way?
we work for the the same department, so we have.
Right. Okay, anybody else has a different point of view? I mean, 53, does anybody think that 60 is a possibility? There you go. Tell me why, sir. Introduce yourself and tell me why.
It's nice to hear the optimism going around, but if we put hard facts on the table, a lot of money has not been pulled out of the stock market as we speak. So there's not been too much of money going out of the economy, and yet the currency has had a one-directional move. Now, for a minute, if we assume a bit of a worst-case scenario, with Europe either muddling through or the crisis worsening, US growth rates not going anywhere, sitting on a fiscal cliff, and a huge risk of sentiment, that would clearly point out that the currency in terms of inflows would be either drying up or stay tepid. And if there should be any flow out of the currency from the Indian markets, then I think 60 and maybe even beyond that is a very realistic.
Prashant, I think you're the best person to respond to this.
I think he's right. If that happens, if let's say $10 billion goes out of stock markets, then what he's saying is right. But the key issue, will that not happen?
Why would it not happen?
I mean, I could turn around and ask why has it not happened in the last few months or quarters? I mean, are things going to get better from here, or are they going to get worse from here?
Okay. Anybody else has a point of view? Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Sanjay. I am from L&T Komatsu. Yeah. I just have a question for the panel. Basically, I agree with this gentleman here. I would like to ask you about your views about India on warning already by international rating agencies for de-rating. And in case that happens by December, will it not have impact on currency?
If I can take that, I think we are looking at...
Mainly considering the policy paralysis,
right,
which was the major reason.
Yeah, no, we've thought this through. And the reason why both Ashish and I have a 58 as the upside is because we see countervailing forces. One would be, I mean, if there is a move towards a rating downgrade, yes, it will lead to some outflows. But as we go into November, December, the probability of both the European Central Bank and the Fed, which is now pretty much committed to QE3, will throw money at the problem. So on the one hand, you have some amount of considerable risk aversion building up towards India. On the other hand, you have this liquidity flow. On balance, if you ask me for an equilibrium level of the currency, where it will settle, I mean, the limited point we are making is that given these sort of forces which operate on both sides of the balance, it should settle at 58 and not move all the way to 60. That's the only difference between, because you shouldn't forget the fact that there is a slow build-up towards this, what they call reflation, or money pumping in. And that, if you sort of looked at episodes in the past, has been very positive for emerging markets and the rupee.
Also, Ashish, being a treasurer, do you think RBI is going to aggressively step in? Will it allow a situation to run to the level which you're talking about?
See, if you see RBI's action over the last 4 years, it's slightly different from what was, before that. I think RBI has allowed the currency to float more freely over the last 4 years. So if situations like this would happen, they would be there, but they would not stop the direction of the move. They will not hold a particular level for a long period of time. So if they will hold it for short periods of time. If it still pushes higher, they'll let it go. That's been what RBI has been doing over the last 3-4 years.
So even if it has to go to levels which the gentlemen are fearing at some level, you think RBI will allow it?
But I don't think they will stop it completely, no.
All right. Any other point of view of the exchange rate, if it could drastically go up from here, or the level we're talking about, or perhaps even go the other way around? Yes.
One viewpoint that I would request from the panelist. We are living in a world which has never ever seen so many central banks holding the treasury rates so very low. I can't recall of any other period. And as very clearly pointed out by the panelist, we are looking at a very long period where the interest rates are going to be very, very benign, probably a decade. That's the kind of feedback that's coming. Now, in this kind of a context where the interest rates are low, the US Treasury yields are virtually nothing, and there are a lot of hot pockets where opportunities are available. If you look at the interest rate arbitrage, India offers a great advantage. But despite all this, for a very long period of time, money has not come in any massive surge. Now, if this is the global scenario that we are talking about, and when we cannot predict for how long it can move, one way by which a country can gain competitiveness is through currency management. So
we've seen China do that.
We have seen China do that. China is now, if you put the globe juxtapose the globe, US is in a fiscal cliff. Europe's problems are not going to disappear overnight. We don't know what will come out of China because the central bank cuts are a bit surprising. So given these three huge exporting and importing potentials suddenly going off the radar, I think the currencies are going to be a tool by which countries are going to either acquire growth or probably lose growth. So in that context, in the global perspective of low growth, and suddenly the powers shifting, US is not going to consume, Europe is not there, Chinese exports will be hit. Where are the markets left? And
so what you're also saying is, in a way, you're corroborating what Ashish said, that if there is a situation that things spin out of control, RBI may not necessarily stem the tide because it will be to our advantage. You can use the term managing your currency or otherwise.
I think currencies will become a strategic tool of either acquiring growth or probably losing it.
It's a valid point. Would anybody like to react to that? Abik?
No, I completely agree with what you're saying, and I think you are also building a scenario where some of the current sort of risk off, where there's a preference for U.S. Treasuries and other risk-free assets dissipates, and the interest rate arbitrage again starts to play out, and then you would sort of rationally expect capital flows to come into growth areas and high interest rate areas like India, in which case you need capital controls if you're managing the exchange rate. And I think over the last 2 or 3 years, capital controls have gained tremendous legitimacy in the world of policy making. And I think although the RBI might sort of follow a hands-off approach on the depreciation side, it might just become a little more active in managing the currency through capital controls or by intervention when it begins to appreciate. So I think it is, there will be currency wars in that sense because...
Would you like to see that happen, Ashish?
I think, there are pros and cons to it. From a market perspective, one would like everything to be free, in the sense of the word, no intervention. So, however, from an economy's perspective, yeah, sometimes that is required, especially in economies like ourselves, which are much smaller, we are emerging economy compared to the globe, and large flows do distort economic activity over a period of time.
But this is a tool that's available to every country. It's not unique to India. And there's a limit to what you can do it, and then beyond which it's going to be counterproductive. So, well, there has to be, a level to which you can pull this theory also.
That's correct, and that's what we have seen countries do. They do it for short periods of time, to a limited extent, other than China, which has managed, for a very long period of time.
Remarkably well. It manages a lot of other things as well. Okay. Any other? Do I see a hand there? Somebody wants to comment on the currency issues or take a punt at the level? Yes, sir.
Oil, what will be in the interest of India, whether depreciating rupee or appreciating rupee?
I think one point which is brought about is we are looking, if you're looking at benign growth, we're obviously looking at benign oil prices at some level. I think there's no argument about the fact that, that interest is obviously there. I mean, if you are importing, 70% of your oil is being imported, so we would like to see the rupee appreciate at one level. But then there is another side of the coin, which Prashant.
I think if rupee appreciates to 50 theoretically, I'm not saying it's going there, it will curtail your fiscal deficit massively. And that is one scenario. I mean, if currency just even goes to 50 to 53, your 1/3 or 40% of diesel subsidy is over. So
Yeah, that's what he's actually trying to say, yeah.
no, but you are not in a position to manage the.
I think there is a very interesting trend that we are seeing on oil. For a very long, for a very extended period of time, now after a very extended period of time, we have seen the price of natural gas at a record low. Now this is something which is very, very interesting, because by the end of this year, US will not be importing oil, is one key point. With the shale gas coming in and fracking capabilities getting extended all over the world, the energy distribution over the next, not distribution, but the energy usage over the world and the means by which it will be going through is going to see a radical change in the next 4 to 5 years. So I think when it comes to oil particularly, we need to take this with a pinch of salt, because there could be some huge surprises in terms of oil.
Right. You want to say something, sir?
Abhik, this is a question which I want to ask you. Like, would it be right to assume that emerging market central bankers have to be slightly more tolerant to cyclical inflation in the near term? In fact, because steady state is not a good state, so they need to be more pro-growth than developed market central bankers.
I think the kind of inflation levels that we've seen, and this is different from what the numbers are for our peers, then there is sort of reason to be a little cautious when it comes to making monetary policy, because we are looking at consumer price inflation of close to 10%, right? And it's not just food inflation that's driving things. Food inflation is spilling over to wages. It's driving the price of other things. So I'm not too sure that at these levels we can afford to be a little more tolerant. Some of our peers, like China, for instance, can certainly, inflation has come down, and if it just perks up a little, or Brazil for that matter, I mean, they could be a little more flexible. But I don't think, and that's how we are a special case, that we don't have those degrees of freedom at these levels.
Did the 50 basis point cut surprise you in the month of April?
Sorry?
Would a 50 basis point cut surprise you?
When?
The April cut did surprise you then?
Yes, certainly. We had expected a 25 basis point cut though, but I would be very surprised if they cut by 50 in the next 2 or 3 months.
All right. Any other view on currency? How many of you are impacted by currency in your lives? You're not, don't you travel? You're not impacted? Okay. Anybody else? How much is the impact? How many people travel out here, by the way? You guys don't travel? You do travel. You don't want to raise your hand, but you do travel. All right. How many of you travel overseas? So aren't you impacted by currency? How many of you travel, okay, let's say overseas and go country by country by country? Go to multiple countries overseas. Nobody? Listen, food is going to be served. It's going to take half an hour. So you might as well raise your hand. How many of you travel multi-cities? You do? What's the problem you face? I face a lot of problems. Do you? What are the problems?
One of the key things, key problems is, of course, the different currencies itself. Because when you're moving from one country to another constantly, you're also changing, your rupee into different currencies.
Right.
And then there is an impact on the various exchanges. Yeah.
So what do you do then? I mean, how do you resolve it? You're carrying various cards, are you?
Now I just carry one card.
You carry one card. Then how do you solve this problem? Traveler checks. You carry hardcore currency. How do you do it? It's really a pain. But
No,
how
I just use a credit card.
you use a credit card?
And I lose money.
You lose money because they charge you an exorbitant fee.
Absolutely,
I mean,
yes.
this credit never comes free, and certainly not on a card.
Absolutely.
So you probably want a solution, don't you? What kind of a solution do you think you'd have in mind?
A multi-currency foreign exchange card, a forex card.
Has anybody heard of a multi-currency foreign exchange card? It sounds very weird, but have you heard of it? Would you like to hear of it? You're not going to be served dinner. Right? Okay, it's something which I myself have personally, I happen to travel a lot because I do a lot of overseas shows. I work with a lot of international channels. And this is something which used to pinch me. I used to carry multiple cards in my wallet. Once I got pickpocketed and it was hazardous. I mean, because I had to go through the entire rigmarole of calling up various banks and trying to get my numbers, try to block all those cards. I was completely at sea. And then I brought this topic up to a friend of mine who was sitting right in front of me, Navtej, and I asked him, like, is there a solution? And he said, there is a solution. I said, what's the solution? He said, I'm not going to tell you. I said, when are you going to tell me? He said, in the evening. So I'd like to call Navtej Singh, Head Direct Payment Products. He's heading the prepaid cards, debit cards, and electronic payments business. And what is kept a close secret will be unveiled now.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, a very, very warm welcome to all of you. And just to clarify the air, I did not have a conversation with him before the event. But yes, I think you've made my job very, very easy. We've always thought of the fact that how do we bring the right kind of products, the right kind of services to our customers. We hear from you and try and build it back into a solution and come back to you. So here it is, without going too much into it, just to go through what we believe is a solution that will help you. Just go back to the point what Chetan was just making. Today when we travel, when we go out, business trips, personal trips, what are the things that we look at? What are the challenges that we face? And what are some of the things that we might not pay the kind of attention we would like to pay in our normal course because they're fringe and they kind of sit on the side somewhere. But when you look at it overall, and if you're a traveler and your company people travel, you would realize that it's a significant impact. And what I heard our esteemed panelists say here, it's the way the markets are growing, the profits are going to shrink, the costs are going to be more and more critical. Let's look at some of these things and see if we can improve somewhere. So what do we do? If we go today, we need Forex. What are the options? And I'm not trying to say the obvious here, but let's look at what are the options. We obviously have cash, we have traveler's checks, we have Forex cards. Forex cards reasonably kind of came up recently in the last 5 years, took the market by storm, practically ate up pretty much in your company's significant portion of foreign exchange that was going in terms of currency to a traveler's check, moved on to a card, immense benefit for the consumers. I heard Prashant say IT services companies have managed their Forex well. We stand testimonial to it because most of our large clients, extremely particular about the kind of costs that they have, extremely particular about the kind of solutions that they want, and hence the Forex card came in and got very successful. It's obviously safer, it's accepted globally. Where do we move from here? If we move from here to a card, a person goes to the US, he carries one card, goes to UK, you want to obviously save exchange rate, you want to be ensuring that you don't pay any kind of a markup on top of it, so you obviously carry a different currency card. So go to 3 different countries, carry 3 different currency cards. Manage those cards, log into each one of them, like somebody was mentioning here. You lose your wallet, you go into 3 different login IDs, find those cards. Tough, we all understand these challenges. Question is, what is it that we would want? And while somebody, gave away the big solution, just if you kind of go into the wish list, so as to say, carry one card to multiple destinations without needing to worry about currency fluctuation. So you load your one card with different currencies, lock your rates, and go on from there. Don't move on carrying multiple cards, right? Don't need to worry about, do you have this currency available or this currency available? Oh, now I'm flying, which card do I take out? Which country I'm in? Just move on, have one card, gives you all solutions. Don't need to, like I said, don't need to worry about any kind of balance transfer. Don't need to worry about, I've finished this currency, extended that currency. Just keep going. Seamless travel, multiple countries, same trip, multiple trips. Have one sign-on option, go into net banking, log into your net, one account, see all your cards, all your accounts, be able to transact within that. And on top of all of this, we at HDFC Bank customize the solution specifically for you, depending upon your processes, your requirements, your needs. Sounds good, doesn't it? So we at HDFC Bank have always thought that we believe customer focus and product leadership are core to our integral values, right? They're very, very integral. How do we build these two into this kind of a requirement and come to you with a product which is first of its kind in the country, extremely powerful? I would not be overstepping my brief, but by saying this is probably the best travel solution in the country today. So I would request Rahul Bhagat to please come on stage and unveil this offering for you right here in front of us. Rahul Bhagat heads retail liabilities, marketing, direct banking channels at HDFC Bank, and I would request him to please present the solution.
May I request my business partner, Uttam Nayak, CEO of Visa, to join me on this? Thank you, Uttam. Thanks, and Uttam, from actually, there's a quick question. What do you think you have to hit to unveil the card? I try. It'll either blow up or something will happen. We'll do it.
So ladies and gentlemen, here it is, the multi-currency HDFC Bank Forex Plus card. Now, we've created a lot of ado about it. What is this card actually about, and what does it do for you? Can I start by saying it's a smart Forex Plus card? You've always had travel cards. Here is a smarter one. How? Every card, most cards today are chip-based. They offer you the right security. Understood. This has it as well. You can top up your cards while you're traveling. You don't really need to. Unlike currency, nobody needs to come and give it to you physically. Agreed, again, a feature you would have heard about. But have you had a card which loads up to 10 currencies in the single card? Here we have it. Simultaneously, 10 currencies loaded on one card. Intelligence. You go into the US, it picks up your US wallet. There you go into Japan, picks up the yen wallet. Move to Australia, picks up the Australian dollar wallet without you having to do a thing. Identifies the country of transaction and picks up the right wallet on its own. Sounds interesting. Manages completely in terms of how the transfer happens. Even if you don't do anything, it will, at any given point in time, if it doesn't have the right balance in a particular currency wallet, shifts to automatically the other wallet. So not necessarily that you have to do it manually. You also have the option of doing it manually and saving some costs for yourself. So overall, some of the things which you would have probably wanted to, but did not have as a solution. Let's see more. You can temporarily block the card and unblock the card as and when you want. So if you've gone on a trip come back, you have some currency left, you don't want to take any risk on the card, just block your card temporarily. Do it yourself, don't need to call a bank. We give you, one of the things that our customers have always come back, particularly for your employees who travel abroad on assignments and are pretty much left on their means that you provide them in terms of per diems and allowances, come back to us and tell us, what if we lose the card? I don't know anybody in this country. As a solution, what we've done in this card is given a backup card to every card. So you lose a card, there is a backup card available in the same kit. Activate it yourself through net banking, and there you have it. All balances get transferred on their own. You can do e-commerce transactions, absolutely. You can personalize your ATM pins. You don't need to really remember ATM pins of 4 or 5 different Forex cards. Get into net banking, change your pin, find a new pin for yourself. And obviously alerts, which is something so critical, particularly when you're traveling abroad, in terms of every transaction that you do, gives you balance of that particular currency along with the alert. So we believe that as a solution, this tapes up pretty much the requirements that we've heard from you. We've tried to put them together back into the card. What are some of the other services? It doesn't end here. We give you concierge services. We give you 24/7 by 365 support in terms of any kind of help you might need, which is not doable over net banking solutions that we've already offered. We also have, as I mentioned, you lose your card. The biggest challenge traveling overseas is how do you hotlist your card? You don't want your money to be misused. And the first thing is, how do I find the number of the bank I'm going to call up? Where do I find that number? Just log into net banking on your own, hotlist your own card. No need to call anyone, 24/7 available at your doorstep. Another thing that we believed, like I mentioned earlier, I think backup card and online activation without you needing to depend on anybody else is a significant improvement over what the current solution provides. Because every other solution, you got to call up the bank or call up the issuer and have that process done in terms of both hotlisting and activating. We give you that power back into your hands. And of course, some things that most cards would carry in on travel, you would obviously need more than anything else is insurance benefits, whether it's on passport, whether it's on baggage, loss, so on and so forth. So completely, ladies and gentlemen, a complete solution from a Forex standpoint. We would like to believe it's right for the time and for the future. We would expect or request and hope that all of you would use it, appreciate it, give us your feedback, as you've always done, and we'll continue to partner with you as you support your customers to build their businesses better. Thank you so much.
If I have to just sum up in 5 words what Navteej said, I was very intrigued by what he said. I'll give it the definition of C. C for convenience, C for currency risk management, C for cash security, C for, convenience I started out with. All right, and C for, of course, the fact that concierge, you said concierge, isn't it? So you got a C out there. And finally, there's clarity. There's no hidden costs. That perhaps is a very important part of what Navteej was saying. Okay, I know you're waiting for dinner, but it brings us to the end of the show. I really thank you for your patience, your support, and your time, and for bearing with me particularly. This is the complete show, right? It's time to finish the show. One final question. Finish and complete. Is there a difference between the 2 words? Is there a difference between complete and finish? There is? Complete is for the day. Forever. Anybody? All right. Anybody? Complete, finish? If you are attached to a good bank, you're complete. If you're attached to a bad bank, you're... And if you're attached to an American bank, you're completely finished. Thank you so much for being with us. Abhik spoke about food inflation. Despite that, we got a scrumptious meal. Please enjoy. Have a good evening. Thank you very much.